So I think we're about to start. There's still a few more people to join us, but hopefully they will. So it's great to see everything so far so good with our technology. But so hello everyone, you're all extremely welcome to our first official Care Day 2021 event. Thank you for taking the time this morning to join us to hear the voices of those young people who have left care during COVID. You'll see from the next slide some of our social media links this morning for VOYPIC and for Queen's University. We'd love for you to join in the conversation on our social media this morning about the event, and we'd ask you to use the hashtags CareDay21 and hashtag LCDC, which stands for Leaving Care During COVID. So before we get into the results of our research and the report itself, I just wanted to give a bit of an overview of who exactly VOYPIC is for those of you who may not be familiar with us. So we are the charity for children and young people with a lived experience of care in Northern Ireland. We work with children and young adults right up to the age of 25, and they may be living in children's homes, kinship or foster care. We also work with young adults who are leaving care, whether they're living independently or in supported accommodation. And we also support children and young people who may be at home in care. We were set up in 1993 by a group of young people in care and professionals who were supporting them. And our job is quite simple. It's to promote the rights and the voice of children in care and care leavers. We want every child in care to have a safe, stable and positive experience in care. And importantly, we want them to be involved in decisions made about their life. So here in VOYPIC, our mantra is that we listen and we learn, and together with young people, we want to create change. So what exactly do? We can divide all our core services into three key themes. We deliver a regional independent advocacy service on behalf of the Health and Social Care Board to children and young people who are living in care and to those young adults who are moving on from care. So that service provides practical hands-on support to help young people participate in their care planning or pathway planning and the review meetings. We help them with any issues or challenges they have in relation to their family contact or family time, as we like to call it. We also help them with education, with their accommodation and access to other services. We'll also, on behalf of the Health Board, facilitate a participation forum in each of the 5 health and social care trusts. And that is to help young people engage directly with decision makers and share their views and experiences of life in care and moving on from care. Most recently in our participation programmes, we've just received funding from the National Lottery Community Funds to deliver a project called See Me, Hear Me. And this project aims to support young people to take on a leadership role and to lead out in social action projects in their local area. But the project's also going to help us improve our own support to young people who are moving out of care by providing some peer support groups and also by providing community volunteers and mentors to support them near to where they live. And a key aspect of our work then is how we try to influence positive change within care. We provide lots of opportunities for children and young people to meet directly with decision makers, from the trusts right up to the Health Board, right up to our government officials and our MLAs, so that they can hear directly and hear the messages directly from children and young people, because they're the experts by their own experience. So the reason we're here this morning then is to hear about the impact of the coronavirus, the pandemic, and the resulting restrictions and lockdown. So I'm sure we can all cast our minds back to March 2020, when we all became aware of the threat of the virus, and we'd never had to deal with such a crisis like this. So services across Northern Ireland had to adapt very quickly to the public health messaging and guidance and begin to provide their support to their clients and service users using very different and alternative means. And that was also very true for VOYPIC. So in March, we became aware that this was going to have a great impact on our work. And mid-March, we began to wind down our group work and our Young People's Conference that we had scheduled for the end of the month. Then by mid-March, the advice was against all non-essential travel and contact, and that strong message and advice to work from home where possible. And then we went into a national lockdown. So in VOYPIC, we very quickly made a huge effort into getting our team set up to work remotely so that they can continue to provide much needed support to children and young people in care. So between March and June, in the initial lockdown, we continued to provide our support to vulnerable children and young people and the wider community. We made an effort not only to reach out to the young people that we were currently in touch with at that stage, but we also reached out to children and young people that we had supported in the 12 months before that, as by way of checking in. So all in all, in those first 3 months of the lockdown, in addition to the young people we were already supporting, we made over 3,438 calls to children and young people to check in, to see how they were and to see what their immediate support needs were. Some of the young people needed very hands-on practical support, and others needed a listening ear, a personal support down the end of the phone. So some of these young people, and we supported 353 of them this way. Some of them required daily telephone contact, some of them weekly, some of them fortnightly, and some of them just wanted us to keep in touch on a monthly basis. So we provided that support to 353 young people. During that initial period, we also delivered 51 care packages. So these were types of, they could have been food parcels, also top-up vouchers for gas, electric, data, so that young people could keep in touch. We provided utility vouchers as well. We also supported a number of young people to apply and successfully apply for emergency grants to help them get through that initial phase while some of our statutory services were still getting organised. Keeping in touch and communication was a huge issue for our children and young people, and being able to keep in contact not only with their families, but also being able to contact our advocates here in VOYPIC. So we provided 26 tablets or devices to children and young people living in residential care. We also delivered 17 online projects with COVID-19 specific themes. So while we couldn't meet groups of young people face to face, we made a huge effort to make sure that we were still able to bring groups of young people together virtually. We also had to increase our social media output, and we created or shared 198 COVID-19 themed social media posts. These were to encourage young people to look after their mental health and provide some type of activities to keep them occupied during lockdown, whilst also trying to signpost them to other forms of support. And since then, we've continued to support a growing number of children and young people. From April until the end of December, we have supported 441 young people through our individual advocacy with over 500 cases. Another 140 young people have received other forms of one-to-one support, whether that's help with their emotional well-being or a listening ear for that befriending mentoring role. And 79 young people have continued to engage in our participation forums online. And then over Christmas, we were grateful to Bernardo's, and we were able to access £10,000 of the Department for Communities Seasonal Fund. So this meant some of our most vulnerable children, young people and their families received additional support over the Christmas period until the end of January. So in mid-2020, as changes were being made to the children's social care regulations, we knew that it was going to be extremely important to hear directly from children and young people. And that's why we asked Queen's to help us to hear from young people who are moving out of care directly. We also know that it's important to hear directly from those children and young people who are still living in care. And thanks to support from Children in Need, we're just about to embark on a co-produced project to go out to talk to children and young people to find out, those living in care, sorry, to find out what their experiences has been. But this morning's event is all about hearing directly from those young people and young adults who are moving out of care during that initial lockdown period. So the agenda for this morning, I'll shortly be handing over to Professor Berni Kelly from Queen's University Belfast, who's one of the authors of the report, and she'll give you an overview of the findings from her research. And then we're going to hear directly from John, who's a young adult who has himself moved out through care just last year. We're going to hear about his own personal experience of COVID and the lockdown and what impact that has had to him. And then it's time to hear from you. So we'll be splitting up into discussion groups towards the end of the roundtable so that you have a chance to talk through what you've heard this morning and maybe what are some of the key learning points, the takeaway messages from our young people. So now I'd like to hand over to Berni, who's going to take you through the background to the research and then present some of the main findings.
Hi there, just bear with me while I get this going. Okay, can everybody see that and hear me? Thanks for the nod. Okay, thanks everyone for attending today and for this opportunity to share the findings from our study that Alicia has just introduced. And I also would like to take this opportunity before I start just to thank Alicia and VOYPIC for funding and supporting this study. It's a very important study in terms of having some research evidence that gives us insights into the experiences of care leavers as we continue to live in this pandemic. So today I'm going to give you an overview of the study and then some of the key findings and finish off with some of the key messages from the young people for policy and practice. When we started the study, we began by looking at the existing literature to see what had been done so far in terms of the experience of care leavers during the pandemic in the UK, in Ireland and more globally. And we found that the small number of studies that have been undertaken were mainly survey-based. So they were timely, they were done quite quickly, and they did give some broad indications about the needs of care leavers. But they didn't tell us about the actual experiences of young people leaving care at this time or their particular views. So this was an important study in terms of contributing the actual experiences from the voices of young people themselves. The study also happened at the same time that a small group of similar studies were happening in Wales, Scotland and England. So it's been wonderful to have this opportunity to do it in Northern Ireland and to contribute the views of young people living here. So our objectives were to explore the care leavers' experiences of the impact of the restrictions imposed as a result of COVID-19, to examine care leavers' reflections on the impact of the current circumstances on their wellbeing and support needs, and then to look at policy and practice issues to investigate the effectiveness of different service approaches for care leavers during the pandemic, and to ask care leavers what their thoughts were about best practice and areas for improvement. So we had a qualitative methodology rather than a survey, and we conducted interviews remotely by telephone or by WhatsApp with 24 young people leaving care aged 18 to 25. The interviews were concluded by September last year, so it was around the time that young people had lived through restrictions, but had also experienced the easement of restrictions. And of course, as we all know, we've gone back into restrictions again, so the findings are all the more important now. We did have a good range of demographics across our sample, so we had a range of ages from 18 to 25, and we had a mix of gender. And we also had young people at different stages of leaving care. Some were still in their care settings, some had left before the pandemic, and some left during the pandemic. So we had a good range of experience. And we also had young people from all the different trust areas in Northern Ireland, which was really helpful to get a breadth of experience across the region. So we interviewed these young people, and we had 4 broad key themes in our interviews. First of all, we wanted to ask about what their life was like during the COVID-19 pandemic and during the various stages of restrictions. We also wanted to ask them about the impact that had on their well-being and their experiences of support. We wanted to hear about their hopes and fears for the future, and then the key messages for professionals. So when we'd analysed the initial findings from these interviews, we then presented them at a roundtable with practitioners and the Commissioner from the board to share those initial findings and to explore the implications for policy and practice. And that was really helpful in terms of thinking about how can we use the findings of this research to really improve support for care leavers. Before I present the findings to you, I want to just highlight that there are, of course, some study limitations. When you do a qualitative piece of research, it's usually small scale, so it can't claim to be representative of all young people right across Northern Ireland or a wider population of youth leaving care. But it does give us the qualitative insight that is missing from the literature base on the experience of care leavers. Also, it was really helpful to recruit via VOYPIC because it meant we could do the study very quickly and we could recruit young people in a very sensitive and clear manner. But of course, that means we only contacted young people who heard about the research through VOYPIC. So we didn't recruit via the range of other providers. We're not overly concerned about that because we feel we did meet or recruit young people right across the region. So we feel we had a good representation across our sample, but it is worth noting that it was a clear recruitment strategy through VOYPIC. So in terms of the findings, I'm going to present those to you across 5 key themes. So there were disruptions, continuities, care leaver responses, the mental health and well-being of care leavers, and then the professional responses. So as I present these themes to you, I'm going to be showing you some quotes from young people which have been anonymised, just to illustrate for you the views of the young people that we interviewed. So let's start with disruptions then. As expected, I think we all have experienced disruptions in our lives over the past year. So as expected, we heard about disruptions to the lives of young people. But these young people had particular disruptions given the context of leaving care. So they had reductions in contact with birth family and friends. They had delays with decision making and delays and changes to transition plans. So for example, some young people who had expected to leave care at a particular stage ended up having that delayed or postponed. And some young people were unsure about when they were going to be moving on or making changes to their living arrangements. There were also changes to work and education and where they could live based on the safety of themselves and others. So for example, Una was a young person who described having to pack her things into a bag, just like before, the typical black bag, as she says in this quote, and make an unexpected move when she was asked to leave her home with older relatives for their safety because she worked in a care setting where she would be vulnerable to bring an infection home. So Una explains here, you know, the typical black bag, and the same thing happened again, even though I've been there for years. So very unexpected and sudden changes there for Una. Interestingly, however, there were also benefits of the changes due to lockdown restrictions for several young people. Young people told us about appreciating that there was less rush, there were fewer crowds, particularly for young people with social anxieties. That was a positive. Some young people felt it was a time for reflection and to focus on themselves, and others described some positive changes that happened in their lives because of the impact of the pandemic and the restrictions. So Ellen says here, it made me kind of focus on more myself, time to do the things that I wanted to do. And Lorraine, who made a decision to leave a negative relationship, explains, lockdown kind of made me realise I needed to leave. It's the best thing that's ever happened, to be fair. So you can see that there are a mix of experiences there in terms of the disruptions. Young people also talked to us about continuities. So despite those disruptions, there were some continuities, albeit with some changes to the mode of engagement. So education often did continue, but of course it became remote learning to enable completion of studies which was challenging for some young people who didn't have access to some of the equipment Alicia was just mentioning, like laptops or Wi-Fi, or had poor access to Wi-Fi in their area, or lived in homes that were very disruptive or noisy in terms of trying to continue to engage with their learning. Young people talked about being able to continue spending time at home, and some of them really valued that time to actually engage with people in their home and to engage with their carers or their family members. And also then maintaining contact with family and friends, which of course was not in the way they usually did, and again relied on use of technology when available. Sadly, however, some young people also said that isolation and loneliness was a continuity. It was already a feature in their lives, so it wasn't a big change for them. So Brona here explains, my life wasn't the best before lockdown anyway, because I was actually like more living in my bedroom and wasn't doing much. So we have continuities there, but we also had then caregiver responses to the COVID-19 and its restrictions. We found on the whole that the majority were very compliant with guidance and were very aware of the risks to themselves and others, and very responsible in terms of their response to that. Most found that they sought out distractions to try to make their way through imposed restrictions, particularly lockdown. So they've tried to engage in different activities like games or baking or exercise at home or daily walks, and to spend more time with family to distract them from concerns about living through the pandemic and these restrictions. And some had learned strategies to help maintain positivity, and indeed some of them felt that they'd learned these strategies during their time in care. So Rachel explained, for example, depression's a big thing. I wrote down like 100 things I'm grateful for, and I felt that that really helped. So you can see there are examples of young people really taking actions to keep themselves thinking positively. Several also indicated that being care experienced really helped. So Rihanna here explains, care experienced children are that used to unfamiliar circumstances and things changing that quickly that we can quickly adapt to whatever the new situation is. But others found lockdown difficult, and they described just getting by. Alex here explains, I can't say I coped with it, but I just say it passed. And we did have lots of examples of young people describing this experience of just letting it pass by or just getting by. We had another young person, for example, who explained that they slept all day and played their PlayStation all night to just get through the lockdown experience. So we also heard then, of course, about mental health and well-being, and a very strong theme in our findings was the negative impact of the pandemic on the mental health and the emotional well-being of caregivers, and that was particularly acute for those who had pre-existing mental health needs. Many really struggled with their mental health and emotional well-being, and Phoebe explains here, my mental health, like the amount of times I would have found myself crying, like or cracking up, I was just at wit's ends with. I found myself getting really frustrated easily. And what was particularly difficult for young people is that normal coping strategies were not accessible. So young people said, usually I would go and visit my friends, I would go out for dinner or go out for a night, I'd meet somebody and go for a walk or do something together, or I'd go to the gym, and all of those things weren't accessible. So they weren't able to rely on those normal coping strategies to get through. And overall, there was a profound feeling of isolation for some and a need for more support. And Alex explains that here. I couldn't get support from someone. You feel like lonely and no one is helping you. I feel like I'm the only one living in the world and life is terrible, struggling. So when we spoke to professionals, they described that during the initial pandemic and the lockdown, that they prioritised cases for contact, socially distant contact, and for support during lockdown. However, this process of prioritisation was not clear in each area, and we spoke to some young people in this study who felt that they had missed out on support services that they needed, as you can see from that quote. So let's look at the professional responses. Certainly, yes, additional support was very much valued by young people, and they talked particularly about appreciating food parcels, IT equipment, vouchers for Wi-Fi or financial support. But unfortunately, that wasn't consistently available. And some described having lots of contact or more contact than ever before, whereas others talked about having a very much reduced contact and support, and some really seeing that contact just stopped and they had no support. So that worries us in terms of thinking about a postcode lottery of service provision across the region in Northern Ireland. Some young people also who had really significant needs and who had reached a point of crisis over the time or before the time we spoke to them had described finding it really difficult to make contact with key professionals and to get a good response. So Rihanna describes here, my mental health started really deteriorating. I needed help. Nothing was put in place. I was left basically in the lurch. And several also described being let down by professionals who failed to maintain contact and felt that their transition-related milestones were being ignored. So young people described that they wanted professionals who would make themselves available and who would keep up with promises to keep in touch. Elena describes that very well here. They should be putting slots available to be ringing you instead of me trying to get hold of them and not one of them answering their phones. So young people also described limited consultation and not feeling a sense of involvement in decisions made about services and changes to services. And some described delays or breaks in services as professionals took time to process implications of public health guidance. But that left young people feeling that there were unnecessary delays in re-establishing the support that they needed. And they felt that some professionals took too long to decide what was possible and to work that out. Rona describes here, it was a very difficult time for me because social services couldn't come near me. They didn't know what they were allowed to do. We also had a very clear message from young people for professionals that yes, remote virtual contact was necessary, particularly when we first went into lockdown and we had to get our heads around using lots of technology and different ways of communicating and supporting young people. But that was sometimes really difficult for young people who had limited or no access to the internet. So Jennifer explains here, like Zoom calls, I just hated it. Whenever I was doing Zoom calls and stuff, it was like draining my data. And Jennifer described having to make decisions about whether to attend a lengthy meeting with her social worker or whether to keep that data to be able to keep in touch with her family and friends. And Judy explains it's actually quite hard for me because I don't have Wi-Fi and stuff, so I can't always get on to the phone calls. So you get a real sense there of a digital divide with some young people really not being able to access the virtual support that was available. And young people very strongly said that they preferred face-to-face contact as restrictions eased. They understood that had to be safe, that it had to be socially distant, and that it might take a while to re-establish, but it certainly is what they preferred. Rona explains here, I still feel like there could have been someone physically there for me and it would have helped me a lot. Whether or not they were in the same room as me, that I could physically see as a comfort and they didn't have to come near me or touch me, but just to be there in the room was important. Young people missed the in-person contact with professionals that they felt they needed to keep up their relationships and to offer them some comfort. So to finish off, I want to show you the 10 key messages that young people had for policy and practice. I think these are really important for us to think about in our discussion groups as we talk later on this morning about the findings. But the first key message was that young people need professionals who keep in touch consistently and really make an effort to maintain their relationships. We also need to strengthen systems of support around the young people, and that includes their informal supports, their peer networks, their family carer relationships, and community-based services in their area to address the high level of loneliness, isolation, and anxiety that we heard about in our interviews. Young people also need clear routes of access to professionals who can provide prompt advice and support. They need somebody to answer the phone. They need somebody to step in and offer them support when they're experiencing a crisis or a severe disruption with their housing, education, or their transition plans. As I've just said, some need socially distant face-to-face support, and professionals need guidance on how to provide that in a safe way for those who need it. Young people understood there would be changes to services as restrictions came in, but they wanted clear information about those changes. And they just really wanted to know what they could expect in terms of level of service and type of service at different stages of the pandemic. They also wanted to be genuinely consulted and involved in decisions and plans about their lives at this very critical time when they were making major transitions from care. They wanted more practical support. They very much appreciated that support of food parcels, IT equipment, Wi-Fi, and they needed more of that. And I'm sure at this time of lockdown again, that's required again. During the pandemic, of course, lives continue. Milestones happen in the lives of these young people. They turn 18, they leave school, they pass exams, and they're making big decisions, and they need those milestones recognised and supported by the people in their lives. And for some young people, that was their social worker or their PA, particularly if they didn't have a lot of informal support available. They were also experiencing major endings, like leaving residential care, moving into their own place, and moving on to university or college. And they needed some support with those changes, like help with finance to pursue education or support to set up a new home. And that really would have helped them to reduce their anxieties and focus on the positive opportunities that brought for them in the future. And finally, given our last point there in the quotes I've showed you, we really need to target the emotional well-being and mental health of care leavers at this time. We need to have them develop those self-care strategies that some of the young people had, but we also need to offer them targeted and accessible services, particularly for those with acute levels of need. These 10 key messages are particularly important now that we're back in another phase of lockdown, and hopefully in the coming months we'll be easing ourselves out of these restrictions, and the messages that we have from these young people will be all the more important as we relive that process. The full reports, including a longer version but also a shorter version for young people, are available on VOYPIC's website. I know that Lee is going to share these slides after the event, so you'll be able to get that link. We're going to go into discussion forums after we hear from John, and these are the key questions that we think that would be important to discuss, keeping in mind the findings that you've just heard about. So what stands out for you from the report about young people's experience of leaving care during COVID-19? Is there anything unexpected in what you've heard from my presentation? What are the key areas of learning from the report? And you may want to think about your own area of work and engagement with young people leaving care. What are you taking from the report to inform your practice and what you do? And from the recommendations, what are the practical steps we can take to better support young people leaving care? And now that we've moved on a bit compared to 12 months ago, are we better prepared to support young people leaving care during a pandemic? I am going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to hand over to John, who's going to tell you about his experience.
Hello everyone, my name's John Bratton. I'm 20 years old and I'm a first year student at Liverpool Hope University studying social work. My time now, I'm just going to have it in question format and then I'll just give the answers as they come. The first question, tell the people a little bit about your care experience and background. I first came into care when I was 17 after the breakdown of my adoption placement due to alcohol addiction in the family. The couple couldn't biologically have children for a very long time, so they decided to adopt in 2004 and have me and my twin brother at the age of 3. Then miraculously, they had my younger brother, my younger sister, biologically in 2005 and 2007. And then ever since then, until we were 17, we were experiencing and we were subject to certain forms of abuse and neglect. So this then led that we left the home early 2018. And I was put into a supported lodging with a woman from Action for Children, and I stayed there for 6 months. It was a very good placement and I was very grateful to have it. But at the end of the 6 months, I felt very ready to go into my own independent home. So I got a 1-bedroom flat and I lived there for 1 year and 4 months during my last 2 years of my A-levels that I studied in Derry. The second question, what stage of life was I at when we went on the lockdown? So obviously I just moved into the 1-bedroom flat. I was in my last year of my A-levels. Obviously COVID happened in March. I found it quite difficult, I found it very strange doing the last year of my A-levels. Your A2s are meant to be very hard, and they definitely were. I was studying maths and Spanish. I already completed a PE, got an A in that because I repeated. So only had 2 subjects, but even then I still found it very hard in my final year. I obviously still found it quite difficult. It was very hard doing the maths because I found it difficult enough as it was in the classes, being taught directly from a teacher, but having to learn them myself through a limited amount of notes, I found it very difficult. And at this point in my life, I was very hopeful of going to university. That was the main goal of my whole entire life growing up, was to make it to university. And now that I've made it, I'm buzzing. The next question, what did I find challenging about lockdown? I think the main thing was I had 0 human contact, and that sounds very funny the way I said it, but it's exactly how I felt. I had 0 family support, and the only support I had maybe was social services and a few friends and their families. I had a very good relationship, and I still do, with my relationship with my social worker, but obviously that sort of went out the window because of the lack of me getting to see him and stuff. I had no training for football or Gaelic, no matches, and I found that beneficial mentally and physically, but obviously that couldn't have happened. I found it very hard to stay motivated to do schoolwork. Sometimes I felt like the walls were coming in on me. I felt like I was stuck in this one room. I find it hard to get out of bed sometimes, and I just played the PlayStation all day. And after a while, it just got unbelievably boring. And overall, I just felt very, very lonely and isolated. My next question: were there any positives about lockdown? I'd see myself as a quite positive person, so I found this question quite easy. The visits that I got from my social worker when restrictions eased, he would come out in his car to the front of my flat building, and we would have a good talk for about 30 minutes to about an hour, and I would get out everything in my mind that was going on. He would tell me about his life, about how his organisation, how it's changing every week, and how they can't see certain people and all these different changes and stuff, which I found quite interesting. But this visit from my social worker, I see him more of almost as a father figure, or maybe the closest I've ever had to one. I valued this time with him a bit more, and I think I will value my time with him in the future a lot more, and I feel more grateful to have people like him in my life. I also went on a lot of walks, and there was a trend going around at the time, as I remember. All the young people were tagging each other on the Instagram stories, and you had to do a 5-kilometer run, and you had to run 5 and nominate 5. And I remember doing that, and I remember having a good buzz afterward because I don't really do much running. But also, from the report, it did say some care leavers said the world stopped for them and they were able to have a breather. I could relate to this because I felt like the last year of my A-levels was coming very quick and fast, and there was just so little support from the school, and it was just ridiculous. I found it quite ridiculous. And then overall life, I felt it had a bit more value, and I appreciated the little things that came up. The next question: what support did I get that was helpful, and what support would have been helpful? So obviously, as I said, the visit from a social worker, that was brilliant. That was the 30-minute to 1-hour talks that we always had. In April, I formed a bubble with my best mate's family. Obviously, I lived in a 1-bedroom flat, and if I had shown symptoms, I wouldn't have went to my best mate's backyard or whatever. But I was always come around on a Saturday for Chinese or whatever it was, or watch the match or whatever, and spend time with her family. And I gained a massive relationship with the whole family. Like, she has a big family, there's 6 of them, and each and every last one of them, I created this bond with them that I would never have had. So I would now call them almost my family. So that was a brilliant positive to take from it. All my relationships sort of grew, and they were a bit more valued, because us young people, we like to stay in contact through text anyways, or through Snapchat or Instagram or whatever. So we sort of valued the FaceTime calls, we valued the Zoom calls, and the things that I didn't find helpful, were the false promises I received from different social workers. My social worker, and I don't blame it on him, it's definitely not his fault. It was maybe the structure or how unprepared these organisations were, but he was making these promises that we would go a walk down the quay, or we would go to the gym together, or we would go and run, or whatever, socially distance run, but they never happened. And because I'm in a flat on my own, I'm always thinking about this. I have something looking forward to look forward to, other than that Saturday with my best mates. This odd Wednesday that I could see my social worker and go a run with them or whatever. I found that I don't know, I just built up this massive exciting factor inside my body, and then when I finally came to it, I was just so let down. And I've experienced this my whole life, you know, through negative models in my life, role models in my life, just negative adults and stuff. So I was used to that sort of, and I wasn't expecting it from my social worker. I found that he was the last person that I was going to experience it from, but it wasn't his fault, and I understand it's not his fault, but it made me feel frustrated with the government, or maybe with the trust, or whatever it was, or the organisations, that they were just so unprepared, and I found that just quite ridiculous. They could have done more walks, more phone calls. I could have got a wee bit more reassurance, and I know that I was 18, 19 at the time, but I could have done with more confidence boosts. I feel like a lot of more other young people could have done them with them as well. Maybe a text saying, look, you're doing brilliant, and it doesn't matter. I know we're going through a tough time, but there are people out there who love you and stuff like that there. I feel like I could have got that a bit more than what I did. But anyways, on to the last question. What should decision makers think about to support young people leaving care in the future, whether there's a lockdown or not? So I have to look at this from my point of view of being a trainee social worker, and from a very personal point of view. First thing I said was notify them of all changes statutory, as I was left in limbo. I was seeing my social worker once a fortnight to once a month, and I was prioritised at the bottom of the list. What I mean by this was when I turned 18, I was up here in the priority list, me and my twin, but he has autism, so he's a very high anyway. He's going to be in the highest priority anyways, but I was dropped to the very bottom. And from seeing my social worker once every fortnight, it was once every month, or once every month in a couple of weeks. And I value our time like greatly, and I still do. Another thing, just because they're 18 plus doesn't mean they have less feelings or develop a dramatic change in resilience or knowledge overnight. It's not as if the last day you're 17, over that night you turn 18, you're going to develop all this knowledge and resilience out of nowhere. Because see, I'll give an example. When I was 18 or 19 and I was living on my own, I threw candle wax down the sink, because I thought that's where the liquid went. Like, you know, I was in Egypt, I clogged the whole sink, and I had a plumber on, and I had to pay for it. It was ridiculous. Like, but anyways, I did a recent reading with my social work course, and I found this quite interesting. It was research from the Children's Society in the Bob Ritmire Monroe report, and it said professionals assume that older children are more resilient than what they are, and this really hit home, because ever since I've turned 18, the supports have definitely went down, never mind lockdown. And then when lockdown happened, then I barely got any support. There was also a quote that I got from Lee, who helped me. He gave me the opportunity to do this today. He said about, if I can remember, it's on the top of my head. Young people can only be resilient when they're given like the resources to become resilient. I don't want to say that on my own without giving him any credit for it, because it was him that told me it. And I also read about this project that was done in 2017 or 2018, the Stay in Close project from the St. Christopher organisation, and they had 4 key things that a care leaver had like highlighted that they would have wanted after leaving care. And the first thing was a consistent bed, like a pop-in bed for when they return home for this. So this could be like, say, for example, I'm in university in Liverpool now. If I was to come back at Christmas, which I did, I would have somewhere supplied for, which I did. But if I was to come back now on Easter, or like I'm coming back this weekend, I would need a bed. I would love to have the same bed, because it would act as a bit more stability. I would have the same bed rather than going to different beds, and it's not a good feeling, you know, not really having your own bed and stuff, and it's your hometown, but you don't have a stable bed. I feel like that's a big factor. The second thing that they highlighted, a participation worker for independent living skills and a plan for transition. So when I first moved out into the 1-bedroom flat, I found it quite hard learning all these independent skills. Definitely the worst was learning how to use a wash machine. Found like that was the hardest thing to do. There's just so many buttons, but I got the hang of it then at the end up. But I feel like a participation worker would be very well suited for people like me, care leavers, because I feel like a lot of them are left to learn on their own, and I feel like that's quite, I don't know, I find that I have a strong opinion on it. I feel it's quite ridiculous. I think there should be more engagement between professionals and young people in that sense, the practical skills that they need to learn. The third thing they said, a 4-bedroom home, so you get the full experience. So this must mean, I didn't delve too deep into this one, but I think this one means that when they're living with other people, the social interactions, and they're learning how to share, they're learning how to keep others in mind and be a bit more empathetic. And these skills are what they're going to take on when they're older. And the last one was support for home staff so that they feel more like family. Because I'm sure the majority of young people, they would see that these people, these staff in care homes or these staff in supported lodgings, that they would see them almost the closest to family than what they've ever had. And that's what I would say about my social worker. I'd say he's the closest I'd ever had to family, and he's made me feel feelings that I probably never experienced. But they were kept. Anyways, I feel like I've talked for too long. Lockdown was obviously very hard, especially for all young people. And I feel like it was, I'm going to be a bit selfish. I feel like it was a bit harder for all the care leavers because they've had a lot more issues. I mean, they can't go into their living rooms. Some of them can't go into the living rooms and see their mum and dad and be like, "Mum or dad, here, look, I'm having a tough day and I want to have a chat with you." And then they can't go and bring their social worker then because their social worker is off for weeks because of the pandemic, whatever's happening. And just that's just a bit hard. I feel like I have to be selfish in that sense. People with mental health issues would have struggled, no doubt, 100 million%. I feel like that was the biggest problem because of the lack of distractions that Berni had brought up there. And I feel that people who weren't even struggling with mental health issues before the pandemic, who were care leavers, I would probably say that they've definitely developed them as well, developed these problems or developed these mental health issues out of nowhere, which is completely understandable due to the situation. But I don't want to end it now. I want to end it. There was unexpected positives. I gained a brilliant relationship with my best mate's family, and I felt feelings that I feel from my social worker that I've never felt before. The feelings of feeling loved and cared for and wanted. And the pandemic almost worked in my favor, as in I've started to see the world in a far more glass half full kind of way. And the last thing I'll say is that the relationship with your social worker and the professionals that you work with is detrimental and very key for the young person. So thank you very much for everybody for listening, and I appreciate your time and I appreciate the opportunity to be on here today.